So at this point, I'd like to introduce Jen Cullen and Nate Mayo. Like I said, I saw them both in action a few weeks ago, and I'm very excited to hear their story and for you to have the opportunity to ask them some questions and answers. I have Eleanor online with the Red Rock team. She's here to manage the chat room. Chat room is a great way to share ideas, resources, anything else you've got. I've got Ali online who is about to press that record button. So all of these things will be recorded, thanks Ali, for future use. So we know that the group today is somewhat compromised because of travel activities and so on. So we do want to make sure that the recording is there as an asset to use going forward. So at that point, I would love to hand it over to our guest, Jen or Nate. I'm not sure who's going to lead the role on that one, but I will leave that to you.
Well, thanks everyone. This is a kind of an exciting and almost a bit of a surprise. It came together rather quickly. I appreciate Julie Marr, who is our newly minted Connecticut liaison, who we're really excited to have working on a lot of the community and government affairs as we you know, sort of build out our operations and relationships in Connecticut. It's a bit of a new frontier for Vineyard Wind, so we've got a lot of learning to do with respect to you know, respect to Connecticut and the ins and outs. So there's a good and growing team of Connecticut folks that we've you know, learned a lot from already. So you know, I saw this as a group that you know, just kind of jumped off the page, of course, in terms of aligned interests. And I think we're going to, you know, go through some basics. I'm sure there's a lot more conversations to be had. I'm joined here by Jen Cullen, who's our head of workforce and development, supply chain initiatives, really kind of at the forefront and in really rarefied company as far as looking at this this industry, which doesn't really exist yet, one that's established in Europe and one that is poised to create a lot of benefit throughout our region, as well as, of course, you know, generating new sources of energy and the core issue here, which is addressing climate change at the regional level. So I will be tapping Jen for her you know, unparalleled knowledge of the labor workforce and supply chain and sort of educational development initiatives that we're facing with offshore wind today. So I just, before we go into Vineyard Wind specifically, I think that we need to you know, step back and figure out what we're talking about with offshore wind. Some of you may have followed this more than others, but it's got a 20+ year history in Europe, and that's been a challenge for some folks in America that we've sort of lagged far behind Europe. But it also provides benefits because the mysteries of offshore wind that may have visited us 15 years ago have certainly been solved. It's an old and established technology that is working successfully throughout Western Europe. 4,000 turbines are spinning off of Europe right now, generating 22 gigawatts of energy. That is an enormous, you know, that's essentially the power for 11 million or more homes and businesses. And that's kind of what we see as the potential in the northeastern United States and further down the eastern seaboard. It's a local and renewable resource. When it comes to our notions of expense and the cost premiums we might have to pay for clean energy, what we see is an increasingly competitive price, projects that can be built predictably, and also those that function on an innovation curve rather than a commodity curve. So what that simply means is if you've got to buy oil and gas to power your power plants, you're subject to the fluctuations of those commodities in those markets. Whereas renewables, and especially offshore wind, its price structure is focused around new innovations. So greater efficiencies and advances will steadily bring the price down. And that's why we've seen today, drawing upon Europe's experience, a cost competitive anchor source of energy for our new grid that we'll be seeing develop through the 21st century. States have led on this. The ill-fated Cape Wind project, which if you look in this multicolored map here, it's that odd little shaped area between Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket was where it was originally sited. That was in 2001. And we've since that process and saga kind of unfolded and ultimately unraveled, policymakers at the state and federal level got together and did the hard work to find out how we would pursue this in a more responsible, inclusive, and broadly stakeholder-based way. So the colored areas you see there are a major portion of the wind development areas on the East Coast. This is the Massachusetts and Rhode Island wind development area, but it also will be serving the projects in Connecticut, including our Park City Wind project, as well as potentially projects in New York with other developers. You'll see some lists of names of companies that basically won the leasing rights to these areas through a competitive auction. It started in 2009 to where we got to these lease areas that you see in this colored area here. And what originally happened was the states, including Connecticut, made a call to the federal government to seek a process for leasing of these federal areas. The areas were, and it'll probably be on the next slide, I'm getting ahead of myself, but they were shaved down by more than half. And that was over several years of stakeholder input: migratory bird pathways, areas with higher fishing activity, areas with navigational concerns, critical habitat for endangered species. They essentially shaved this down to the set of areas that were the optimal balance of all those interests: low fishing activity, low incidence of bird exposure, and from an engineering navigation perspective, areas that could work. So we can fast forward through the state policies that many states have passed: New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts among them, to Vineyard Wind being selected in 2018 to build the nation's first large-scale offshore wind facility. We're currently in permitting on that. There's some slides later to discuss that process briefly. Just last year, in fact, just about 8 months ago, Park City Wind was selected by the state of Connecticut. That project is probably about 2 or more years behind Vineyard Wind's progress. We're essentially at the goal line with Vineyard Wind 1. And that project is slated to supply 14% of Connecticut's electricity. And again, the cost numbers, because the contracts are still being sort of certified by state agencies in Connecticut, it's expected, similarly to the Vineyard Wind project, to be actually a ratepayer savings. Vineyard Wind was identified as producing it's actually 1.4 billion anticipated on-bill ratepayer savings over the life of the project. Of course, the emissions reductions and the tremendous environmental benefit we get by pulling ourselves steadily off of fossil fuels as key energy sources is extraordinary. I'm going to leave the infrastructure and workforce stuff to Jen because she's an expert in this. But I think also, when we approach this broad roster of benefits, whether it be workforce, climate change, and others, with this process has gone forward, it's become increasingly clear as stakeholders that have made their voices heard that the alternatives are pretty stark. We need new sources of energy, and we've got in the Northeast the opportunity to pursue these renewables in a responsible way that's been built on a decade of siting and policy work, or we can continue to site power plants often in areas that at least can bear the added burden of fossil fuel plants in their neighborhoods. We've got to have new sources of energy, and this is really our best shot at competitive renewables in the Northeast and on the East Coast. So, mentioned the siting and the ways that we got to where we are in terms of identifying and leasing off lease areas. There's also been extensive public-private partnerships, research and collaboration on fisheries research, endangered species research, avian work. Some of this work actually began before Vineyard Wind or even any of these lease areas were auctioned off. And that's the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which began to do aerial marine surveys to sort of try to develop a baseline, especially of incidents of the North Atlantic right whale and some other sensitive species, to kind of really begin to guide us into how and where we can pursue these resources. At the community level, we've been equally as active. We are very proud of a partnership with Vineyard Power, which is a community cooperative on Martha's Vineyard, who sought to really change the dialogue early on around offshore wind and build community-based offshore wind. They partnered with us after understanding the technical challenges of a community pursuing its own project via ownership, and reformed their model to partner with an organization that they thought shared the interests and shared the interests of inclusion and community involvement citing these. They also had a heavy hand in making sure that these areas were cited to address community interests. A lot of that's viewshed impact and a couple of other issues. We have a host community agreement with the town of Barnstable, which is one of the was one of the epicenters of offshore wind opposition due to the Cape Wind project. It was a lot of hard work and collaboration to get over you know, a lot of issues and find common ground, and they have become a sincere ally. We're collaborating actually on a number of projects with the town, partly as part of that agreement, but also beyond. We're collaborating on a sewer project with them in conjunction with our work that is actually going to facilitate the addressing of wastewater issues on the Cape. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but wastewater is arguably the sort of #1 environmental issue. It's degrading our bays and estuaries throughout the Cape, and there's a great need for sewer infrastructure. So we worked with them on that. It's going to create cost savings and move those things forward. It can't be understated how important our agreement with NRDC, CLF, and the Conservation Law Fund, and the National Wildlife Federation. After a year of hard work discussing the challenging issue of how do we pursue renewables, understanding that climate is among the greatest risks to our natural resources without impacts to species such as the North Atlantic right whale, which is the most critically endangered major species in our region. It was a year of hard work stipulating multifold monitoring techniques, sound attenuation, really strict time of year things, and a lot of collaboration and open dialogue in terms of data collection. We came to a good agreement that works, that's really landmark and standard setting to ensure that we protect these sensitive species in these environments while pursuing this important global goal. There's fisheries communication began in the mid-2000s with these processes, bringing in fishing interests to understand the complexities there. In this area, the low fishing activity, relatively speaking, precipitated a real focus on navigational constraints. There are very fertile fishing grounds to the east and south, especially of these areas. In the last year alone, developers came together to support one of the core concerns of fishermen and established a uniform 1x1 nautical mile, and a nautical mile slightly larger than a statute mile that we normally deal with, 1x1 nautical mile grid throughout all lease areas to provide predictable transit lanes, which the Coast Guard has recently assessed are fully sufficient to facilitate smooth navigation through these areas. It was a major concession and a major development in our overall offshore wind landscape. It's going to result in roughly a third reduction of overall capacity to develop, and it will make these areas the most sparsely laid out offshore wind facilities in the world, and that will do a lot to facilitate shared use. The consultation is broad ranging, some within our permitting matrix, which is very intense, dozens of permits from the federal level all the way down to the local level. And a range of stakeholders who are hardwired into those processes, whether it's historic preservation, the important issues around Native American tribes who have, just a scant few thousand years ago, this area was dry land and was home to some of the indigenous populations. So that's kind of a snapshot of the stakeholder work that we've been doing. Meetings like these, meetings at the local level, which we strongly anticipate will be continuing through our Park City Wind project and others. So quick geography, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jen on this slide. You can see in this lower right here, that's the Vineyard Wind lease, one of the Vineyard Wind lease areas. The northern part of this lease area is slated for the Vineyard Wind 1 project, which is, as we said, at the goal line. And the due south of that is where the Park City Wind project is slated for development. We're beginning permitting on that. Both projects will connect to the grid via Cape Cod. Since we have a regional grid, we can gain some efficiencies there. For Vineyard Wind 1, our operations and maintenance facility, which is a long-term base of jobs, will be based in Vineyard Haven, and we've committed to redevelopment in Bridgeport, which Jen is going to talk about, associated with Park City Wind, which is a tremendous economic opportunity that we're really looking forward to pursuing. So why don't I give it over to you, Jen, if this is the appropriate time. You can switch slides if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. If you could flip to the next slide. And I'm seeing some really great questions coming in too that Nate definitely has the answers to. So I'm going to go through the supply chain conversation a little bit, and then maybe we'll do all the questions at once. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Jen Cullen. I am our manager of workforce development and local supply chain. I'm really excited to be here because to me, this renewable energy is the best of all worlds. I come from an advocacy background, a clean energy and clean water advocacy background. I'm from the town on Cape Cod where our cables are interconnecting. So all of the issues Nate was talking about in terms of wastewater and our partnership with the town, it is really fantastic to be part of a team and part of a company that understands the importance of engaging with the communities where we're working. And our workforce development and local supply chain integration is a huge part of that. In addition to all the exciting aspects of bringing real clean energy in a big way to the East Coast, there is a ton of economic benefits that we can reap from this industry. While it has been maturing in Europe, it has turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry overseas, and these global companies are looking at the US market and seeing a lot of opportunity. And the way that the states are requiring us to develop these projects is ensuring that we are capturing as much of the economic benefits locally and domestically as we can. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the supply chain and then the workforce. So this slide here, this graphic lays out how we build the wind farm and the different components involved. And it is a very complex marine infrastructure project. It is more so a marine infrastructure project than even a renewable energy project. We have all of the onshore transmission and onshore works that need to happen, the export cables that transmit the power from offshore to the onshore grid. The electric service platform is the offshore substation that collects the power. There's cabling, obviously, between all of the turbines and that offshore substation. And then there are the foundations and turbines themselves, which are the most visible of the infrastructure, but only one of these major components that we are working with. And then the logistics. So that's kind of the overseeing of knowing exactly when we can do certain aspects of construction, who's doing what, where the vessels are going, how the port redevelopment works. And so each of these suppliers, the way the projects are built, we have between 6 and 8 major contractors that we work with for each of these components of the wind farm. And each of those major contractors need a lot of support in subcontracting services. And that's really for these first few projects where the local supply chain can come into play and where we can reap the most of the local economic benefits is by supporting these big tier 1 suppliers until we have the predictability and the certainty in the US market for these suppliers to set up shop in the US. We know that they are interested in doing that, which will mean more economic benefits and more jobs for US workers. But in order to justify that investment here, there needs to be that pipeline of projects in the foreseeable future. Could you go to the next slide, please, Nate? So as I mentioned, those tier 1 contractors are those major suppliers. So the foundations, the turbines, the offshore substation. And the tier 2 and tier 3, and it even goes further down to tier 4, tier 5, are where we are looking to integrate local businesses. And so Vineyard Wind has a few approaches that we're taking to ensure that we are communicating with and engaging with and pushing our contractors into contracting with those local businesses wherever possible. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the ports, and Nate threw up the map of the Massachusetts and Rhode Island wind energy area, which is on the right side of this map. Yeah, right there where he has the cursor. That's not all of the industry. The industry also has lease areas, or the US has lease areas that have been leased out to developers all down the East Coast, as far south as Virginia, and we anticipate to see some off of the Carolinas released in the next few years. And all of these have gone through very extensive stakeholder engagement processes to understand what's happening in the environment out there, where the navigation and shipping lanes are, and also where the projects can connect into the grid and serve the populations, because you want to connect the projects where the populations are so that you're moving the energy, as little as possible to maintain as much capacity as you can. On the left here, we have a couple of sketches of what we anticipate happening within the 2 ports that Vineyard Wind is currently contracted to be working out of. So for Vineyard Wind 1, we are anticipating operating our turbine staging out of New Bedford. And for Park City Wind, we anticipate, as Nate mentioned, redeveloping the port of Bridgeport to stage our foundation transition pieces. So that yellow piece that sits between the monopile foundation and the turbine tower. And one of our biggest challenges here in the US is that we have a very limited port capacity, and offshore wind needs as much port development as we can get and as much port space as we can get. The ports that serve offshore wind in Europe are hundreds of acres. The port in New Bedford is I think it's about 90 acres, and Barnum Landing in Bridgeport is 17 acres. So we're looking at redeveloping these port facilities that have been underutilized for decades to serve this industry. And with that comes a lot of economic opportunity for these communities that have had these port facilities oftentimes sitting there either underutilized or completely not utilized for decades. And so this is a real opportunity for those communities. And of course, where the components are staged out of is where the jobs are going to be located. So both in New Bedford and in Bridgeport, we're going to need to train up a workforce that can do the work that's happening, not only at the port, but on the vessels that are going to go offshore and do the installation of the projects. Next slide, please. So in terms of training the workforce and integrating the supply chain, as both our Massachusetts bid and Connecticut bids contained different initiatives to do this. Park City Wind, coming 2 years after Vineyard Wind, essentially we took, what we knew was working in Massachusetts for our first project, and we want to replicate that in Connecticut. And that's kind of where I'll focus today, because I know you all have a particular interest in Connecticut. As I mentioned, we really are looking to integrate with the local supply chain. One thing that we are very proud of for our Park City Wind project is our partnership with a company called Keyright. And Keyright is a cable manufacturer. They have been manufacturing cable for 150 years in Connecticut for kind of your traditional onshore electrical cables. And they, with a commitment from us, are able to upgrade their facilities and hire a new workforce to provide the kinds of specialized offshore wind cables that we will need. And we're contracting 50% of our inter-array cables, so the cables that connect the turbines to one another and then that offshore substation, with them. And that'll allow them to upgrade their facilities and hire an additional 35 people for that work. And the only reason we're not doing more of our cabling from them is because that 50% is all they can handle for this first project, and there could be opportunity for them to even further expand. And this partnership will make them the first tier 1 supplier for offshore wind in the US. So we're really excited about that, and it goes to show that we have companies and skill sets here in the US that, with investment and kind of a heads up that this industry is coming and what the needs will be, there's a lot of economic opportunity for those businesses. So that's our major one within Connecticut, but we'll also be working with different partners in Connecticut to host Meet the Buyer events and ensure that our contractors are connected to and aware of the local supply chain. We'll do a supply chain database that we need to develop to understand what the existing businesses are in Connecticut and how they could potentially feed into the supply chain, either with the existing work that they do, or maybe with some additional funding that would allow them to expand their capacity to meet the needs that we have. And we also have allocated some funding that can go to investigating future port sites. So Connecticut is very fortunate in that not only do you have Bridgeport, but you also have New London. And both of those ports are not encumbered by some of the things that we're dealing with in a lot of other states. So when we have these huge offshore wind components, we can't go under bridges or transmission lines, and we can't get these vessels through narrow hurricane barriers. So both New London and Bridgeport are wide open ports, which is unique and really beneficial for offshore wind. And that alone positions Connecticut to be a major hub for this industry. In terms of workforce, sorry, Nate, I'm just gonna hit on that real quick. In terms of workforce, for the construction of the wind farm, we are committed to negotiating a PLA with the local building trades. And we are very far along in that process for Massachusetts. We feel confident that we're going to come to agreement with the trades here within the next few months, hopefully. And that will set the template for what the project will look like in Connecticut as well. And so by committing to utilizing union labor, we will be taking the existing skilled tradesmen and tradeswomen of Connecticut, and they'll need some additional training to do the specific offshore wind work. So you need special kinds of safety training in order to go offshore and do electrical or mechanical or the iron works of the turbines, 50 plus miles offshore. And then we've got all sorts of educational programs that we're working on developing, higher education, offshore wind 101 programs, and engagement with the VOTEC schools and programs as well. So that's something that as we move forward in Connecticut, we'll be building out those partnerships and those programs to ensure that the existing workforce has access to these jobs, and also the future workforce and the next generation will have access to these jobs as your two major ports are built out for this industry. Next, please. So I spoke a little bit about Meet the Buyer events. These are something, it kind of seems simple, bring the contractors together in the same room and ensure that, Connecticut businesses have access to and can bid into open RFPs from our major contractors. But we've had a few in Massachusetts, and it's a really good education for our European suppliers. They're not familiar with this market. They've been working in Europe for 20 plus years, and they don't necessarily know what resources we have here. And so being able to provide them with a database of especially marine focused businesses is really beneficial. And there's a lot of opportunity for those local businesses. Next, please. Workforce development, I put it into 4 buckets. So there's development. So what Julie Marr and Nate and I do in terms of putting the projects together on paper, doing the community outreach, developing the programs and training the workforce and doing the permitting. We are going to have a Connecticut-based office that will host our team. So that alone will be some very direct jobs for the projects. Then, as I mentioned, the construction will be done by the local trades and their training facilities that are actually already set up in Connecticut that I'll show you some pictures in a moment. Operations and maintenance, these are fewer jobs in construction, but these are the careers in offshore wind technicians. So we are going to have an operations and maintenance base out of Bridgeport. We will have probably about 30 technicians those jobs will be around for the life of the project, which is 25 plus years. And so that's a workforce that doesn't yet exist in the US, offshore wind technicians. And so that's something that we'll be working with the community colleges and the technical schools to ensure that we are able to train the right people for these jobs. And then there's going to be a lot of jobs in the supply chain. So that Key Right partnership, those 35 jobs, that's just the beginning. All of the supply chain work that we're going to see and the big numbers you see about offshore wind investment in the US, it's all going to be supply chain from tier 1 down to tier 5, which is really exciting. Next, please. All right, so I mentioned the offshore wind safety training. And so the top left picture and the picture on the right, that big tower, that's a training facility that was just announced last week that's off and running. So Survival Systems USA is a fantastic partner that we have in Groton, Connecticut. And I mean, we're thrilled that they already exist there. They offer top-notch training, civilian and military. They mostly focus on aviation training, and they have a big dunk tank to do helicopter trainings in terms of safety and escape in the unlikely but unfortunate instance of a water crash. And that training alone, the helicopter underwater escape training, is something that's going to be required of all of our offshore workers. They already offer that. And now, because offshore wind is coming so big to Connecticut, they have scaled up their facility to offer the Global Wind Organization basic safety training. Working at heights, fire, what's the word I'm looking for? Fire awareness, first aid, everything in terms of safety training needs to be specific to doing it in an offshore wind turbine. The unique needs of workers being stacked one on top of each other means that you have to learn how to do these things. Even moving equipment, manual handling is an important aspect of the training. And so having this facility and this tower and this partner in Groton is a huge asset for us. On the bottom left, that's our Mass Maritime partner up in Massachusetts. That's their crew transfer training platform. And what they do there is they are able to practice moving individuals from a moving vessel in the water onto a fixed structure. And that is one of the more dangerous aspects of working offshore. And so ensuring that we have the right training programs to get people to be able to do that safely is critical. Next, please. I just wanted to show some of the educational programs that we have gotten going in Massachusetts that we will look to do in Connecticut as well. There's an offshore wind technician certificate program offered by one of our community colleges out of New Bedford. There are offshore wind 101 courses offered at the community colleges as well. And also because our first project's operations and maintenance facility is located on Martha's Vineyard, which is an island, there's a partnership between a local community group and the community college to teach that program remotely on the island. We have a commitment to sourcing or to having all of our technicians be island-based within 5 years of going operational. The easiest way to get there is to train the local workforce that's interested in these jobs. And I think that's all I have for this. So I'm going to hand it back to Nate, and then I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Jen. I'm trying to keep track of some of these questions popping up in the chat. I think we can get to them.
I can shoot them to you if you want.
I've been reading a few of them, and I think we can get through them. I think there's a lot of workforce questions there for Jen. Maybe I'll give Jen a breather, and we can take some of the general questions. I did want to go through just a quick snapshot of where we are today. I'd mentioned some of the background of where Vineyard Wind got to where they are. There are a number of other projects that are in earlier stages, and ultimately, as we'd mentioned, Vineyard Wind is sort of at the goal line. I want to not bewilder you with all these acronyms, but to highlight the fact that there's a major and long-term permitting matrix that we have to move through. We're completed on state permitting and local permitting as well, and that is exclusively in Massachusetts almost, because that's where the cable landfall and those nearshore portions are. At the federal level, we had anticipated beginning construction last fall for Vineyard Wind 1. And just shortly before that, the Secretary of the Interior requested this process is through I'm not going to give too many acronyms, but the NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act process. They develop environmental impact statements, which actually look at the entire environmental, socioeconomic, and other potential impacts and benefits of these projects. So the federal government produced a draft analysis last year, and then in August of last year requested a supplemental analysis. The focus on this specific supplemental analysis was this build out of offshore wind looks more substantial. Let's take a larger cumulative look at what the next 10 years of offshore wind development look like. It's technically under our permitting umbrella, but it really focuses largely, almost exclusively on the prospect that well over a dozen offshore wind facilities could and will be built off the East Coast. That was produced just a couple weeks ago, and we're actually currently engaged. In fact, in about 45 minutes, we have to jump onto one of the virtual hearings that the federal government has put together. At various stages, they do public comment and opportunities for public input from everyone, from business interests to environmental activists, to local communities, to anyone who has interest in the project. So those are going on now. We expect a final statement in November, which will be the final review, and then a record of decision, which is the Secretary of Interior's final go-ahead for the project. And then this matrix, I think I probably included Park City Wind. With Park City Wind, here's where we are, and this is sort of the next one in line. Most projects will be at this level. Just beginning to have the conversations with regulators prior to submission, and beginning those two processes, both at the state level and at the federal level, which go on around the same time. I'll spare you all the acronyms, as I said, but there's dozens and dozens of them. We could spend 20 minutes briefing you on that. So essence of this comes down to the fact that there is an advocacy opportunity, in terms of thinking about this project and future projects. And that process is going on now. Our virtual hearings will be today and then next Tuesday and Thursday. And then there's a written comment period following that will really do a lot to guide the federal government in what they should be doing, how they should be pursuing this. And there's some specific issues around that. I think I included, this is a slide we can email to you, but there's a, for those who want to participate, if this is something you're interested in distributing, we can share that. And this kind of gives, it's a bit arcane and challenging to get into the system, but it's not that complicated. People have been able to participate. The whole COVID crisis, of course, has upended our lives. It's caused a lot of hurt and a lot of disruption in many ways. These virtual hearings have afforded, ironically, some opportunity as people get used to digital tools. Instead of having to drive to New Bedford or Rhode Island or Bridgeport on a cold night, you're actually able to participate at equal level remotely. So we encourage that. This is our information on here, and I think Eleanor, if you want to go down the line with some questions, I think our people here can start to respond.
Great. It might be a little jumping around, but just in the spirit of flow, this seems a very concrete one to be able to visualize the turbine and the cradle to grave sort of life of a turbine. What is the sort of commitment? Paul Murphy notes that California has some older
Yes.
tech equipment left in the desert and that kind of thing.
I think, when we look at, so I do believe, and I'll get to the edge of my understanding when it comes to onshore wind, the projects that have happened out in California and other places, it's been a lot more, I don't want to say freewheeling, but it's likely done on private land or land with pretty, private, non-government owned land, and in instances in which the decommissioning and takedown and that kind of thing is not perhaps clearly outlined. So with our project, understand the federal government is issued a lease and then authorized Vineyard Wind to construct and operate a wind farm, and then is required that Vineyard Wind fully decommission the entire project at its completion. And that is also bolstered by the fact that companies prior to construction are required to post a substantial bond that is held by the federal government, so that against all variables and unknowns throughout the decades of its operation, the federal government holds the resources throughout the life of the project to do that full decommissioning. So the idea of an offshore wind graveyard is not what it would be if, for example, you were building in an onshore area with maybe a lower level of permitting and also potentially on private parcels for which you aren't really required to do those. What they do often, I think, is they put bigger turbines next to the little ones as the technology has gone up and not bothered to take them down because, I guess in their view, why would you? I think that's kind of, it's kind of an apples to orange comparison, but it's a great question.
Thanks. In terms of the Bridgeport port area, Rachel notes that there's a casino project that's been in the news a lot at that port, and what's the interface there between the two projects?
So I don't believe there is any interplay or conflict there, although Jen and perhaps Julie Marr might have a better understanding. I mean, there are areas that we've kind of acquired operational lease option rights to that I think are dialed in. I'm not very familiar with the casino project, but I've heard of it. I don't know if Julie Marr or Jen, you have anything to add to that? I guess not.
Don't, but I do see that we have, some folks on here that I will put my contact information in here as well. If people have any follow-up questions, I will put that in the chat and see if I can get you some of that information. But in regards to the casino, I do not have that information.
Yeah, that can be followed up. But as far as you know, no conflicts or anything, and that's the important thing. Can you expand on the problems a community faces when trying to start and own its own renewable electricity generation? Any lessons from community solar that community wind might learn from?
Right. So, communities do have some capacity, and it's a different state regulatory matrix that often guides that. Towns do have some ability and often some incentives to pursue community projects. There's a few distinctions when you go from onshore wind, which several communities throughout New England have successfully pursued onshore wind to feed some portion of either their municipal energy budget or even been able to get into other arrangements, and community solar likewise. What we see in Massachusetts specifically, and I can only speak to that because it's been quite a saga, and Vineyard Power has played an extremely, probably has been at the pole position in terms of trying to guide this policy. Communities aren't currently, at least in Massachusetts, equipped to make the long-term substantial investments necessary to take part, directly at a financial level with offshore wind. Add to that the fact that what we're talking about with offshore wind is, these projects that have been built in communities are 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt turbines, sometimes getting a bit bigger. We're talking about a single turbine being produced in the deep waters offshore, being tenfold larger. So we're talking about several orders of magnitude of greater productivity and efficiency, but also a greater expense. It's kind of an economies of scale thing. A community would probably be hard pressed to be able to build their own offshore wind project if it were only to supply their municipal load or even their town load. One of these turbines, my town of Provincetown has 4,000 people in it, so it's a small town. One of these turbines will supply more than the energy generation necessary to run every electron in Provincetown. So that is one barrier. I think when you look at these projects, they're multi-billion-dollar projects, and the barriers in terms of that kind of entry are substantial. However, in Massachusetts, and there may be a movement in Connecticut, there is a lot of discussion about allowing communities to try and have more flexibility in making those energy decisions. So what that means is there's a bill called the Community Empowerment Bill that's, as typical as with legislation, if you guys have worked on it, it makes it so close and then it falls back. And they often say it's about a decade before a bill comes from a concept to a law. But it would allow greater ability for towns to say, we would like to procure our energy in a different way, and we would like to be essentially an investor in those. That is fraught at times. There's a lot of in Massachusetts, there's a lot of the state kind of having almost a parental kind of role to keep towns from making the bad decisions. And there's a huge amount of ins and outs with it, but there's some potential there. I think at this point, what we're seeing is the model that is working and that could evolve is community buy-in, community supports around the various features of this, whether it's job creation or community benefit, and that leading to procurements like in this case of Connecticut, where in a few years Connecticut will be pulling 14% of the electrons that it uses from offshore wind, and perhaps more if they engage in future projects.
Interesting. We're also in touch with Sustainable CT, which is helping municipalities commit to incorporating sustainability practices in their municipal operations. And so I'm not sure we have anybody from there on this particular call, but it's certainly, all very related, what you just said.
Yeah, I think we have efficiency issues, but it's we have rooftop solar, right? We have it on our house, and that's what you can do. You can call a contract, you can send it up, there's a law. The next step is like neighborhood or town level, and then you can make a bigger impact. The next step is state level, and the next step is national. It grows out like that, and you get actually a great deal more efficiency in terms of lower cost, lower impact, because we're not doing a million different projects and stuff like that. But it is, we do need more tools at the municipal level to be able to pursue those things. So I'm glad it's happening in Connecticut as well.
Regulatory question about restrictions in Connecticut on wholesale energy distribution, the PURA regulation, and if you have any comments about that.
I do not know whether members of the team do. It's an interesting issue. Energy policy, of course, is very complicated. I don't know that we've come across this. I'm happy to see if there's some follow-up from some of our Connecticut people on the legislative side and others that we can speak to about that. But well,
the questioner did admit it might be a little far out.
Yeah, I know we get deep into the weeds. If you ask me,
so
workforce, I might get there too. Yeah.
This great question from Anthony. What does the term and pay scale? Anthony from Save the Sound, I believe. What does the term and pay scale look like for the jobs that will come to Bridgeport? Seeing this as one of the great infrastructure projects in the area, how might the workforce development strategy build lasting wealth in communities of color, and the potential career base for offshore wind technicians here? Total number of possible jobs, long term,
Take it away, Jan.
Yep, that's a lot of questions. So one of the benefits of us utilizing a PLA and working with the local trades is that we'll be obviously paying union wages, family sustaining wages, and that's during the construction of the project. The construction of the project is anticipated, start to finish to be approximately, 18 months to 2 years, and then the port will transition to have our O&M facility. So, we'll need significantly less space during our operations and maintenance phase than we do during construction, because all the components will, of course, now be installed offshore. That said, during operations and maintenance, those technician wages are somewhere in the 70 to 80,000 a year range. And there's also going to be management and supervisors and administrative positions that'll be offered out of that facility as well. We'll need vessels to ferry the crew out. And so all of that is, encompassed in the jobs and the economic development number estimates that we have with the project. Once we transition to the operations and maintenance phase, we have a small, like I said, we'll need a smaller portion of the port there in Bridgeport. The rest of the port is open for lease for future projects. And once it's redeveloped to serve offshore winds, the idea is that we'll be developing project after project in a predictable and consistent way. And so the ports are going to be needed, consistently project to project, back to back. And that'll be construction jobs for those projects continuously. And then each project will need its own operations and maintenance workforce. So, Bridgeport being able to serve the offshore wind industry and all of the unique things that I was speaking about earlier with the ports, there's every reason to believe that Bridgeport will be serving the offshore wind industry for decades, as we build out this whole industry.
So cool. You mentioned remote teaching capacity, and does that extend toward, in the high school, and the high school grads shift towards vocational tech and clean tech, and students learning online now and less interest in going away to school? Could that all sort of play a role in being able to learn remotely through your training programs, how to gear up for some of this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us could have anticipated all of this. We were kind of fortunate in that, like I said, we were already set up to be offering remote learning because of the unique situation of the jobs on an island community. And it's been going pretty well. And the students too, we weren't anticipating that their courses would be taught 100% online when we set it up. We actually had a grant that was given by Vineyard Wind in the state in order to have faculty teach those courses on the island. And now, because of COVID, we've transitioned fully to remote learning, virtual learning. There is always going to be an element of needing hands-on experience and hands-on technical training, and Survival Systems has been working through, how they're going to be able to offer that training in this environment. I also know Mass Maritime, who's a little bit ahead. They had already offered and completed 2 courses, 2 cohorts of GWO safety trained students before COVID happens. They put courses on hold, and now they feel confident that they're going to be able to figure out how to be offering that training while still complying with all sorts of social distancing and safety precautions. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Students are significantly more interested in vocational technical high schools than traditional high schools in recent years. And I know in Massachusetts, which I'm most familiar with, the tech schools are at full capacity and actually, unable to take all of the students that are interested in coming to the tech schools. And those schools are fantastic partners in turning out a workforce that we're going to need. So I would love to work with Julie Marr and you all to identify, we're just in the beginning phases of identifying these partnerships and these programs in Connecticut. And I see a huge opportunity for us to take what we've learned in Massachusetts and in this COVID situation and translate it in a way that's going to work for training up the Connecticut workforce.
Super. Yeah, there's great potential for that. And the government relations work that's involved in getting the approvals and things, do you see that growing in Connecticut? Are you taking care of that in-house, or will there be some hiring? I think that's the gist of Marna's question related to government relations work in Connecticut.
So is the question about whether we're looking to build out our government relations team?
I think so.
I imagine there is we're in we're in a very early stage. We've got some folks working at the interface there, and some of our technical team works a lot with DEEP and with the agencies. I imagine there may be a greater need for capacity on the government relations side, but I'm not certain what sort of what time scale that's on. You know, we've got one of our government relations people on the phone right now, or on the call right now, and you know, there may be need for other resources, but I'm not certainly not an expert on that.
There was a question, thank you, as there always is in Connecticut, about the tax implications for the local community as well as the investors involved in developing the market. Is that even, have you even arrived to be able to see whether, you know, in Connecticut, you do anything new? And the question is, yeah, are there going to be any new taxes that become part of the, with offshore wind?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, the one sort of macro implication in terms of the, you know, people's individual bottom line is that there is an expectation there will be some modest cost savings, and especially along a sort of a more stable, you know, rate for electricity costs. But there's not. I don't see anything about as that relates to greater or lesser taxation of Connecticut residents. Right.
And the yeah, the question about the Steel Point Harbor development, I think, is related also to the casino as far as what's going on at the Bridgeport port. And David, we mentioned that there's no conflicts with other things happening at the port, but Julie Marr has some is going to look into it a bit more, and we can send some information around as a follow-up. Let's see, what is resistance expected from Connecticut and Long Island and boaters who may not want to look at the turbines? And this relates to a few years back when Blumenthal was our Attorney General and helped us avoid a situation with a floating natural gas barge called Broadwater. If people remember, that was going to be basically, you know, ready to explode at any moment and floating around the sound. So we're glad that didn't happen, because it paves the way for things like yours, but maybe some of the same conversations with fishermen.
Yeah, you know, the short answer to sort of visual impact is that these projects are 15 miles south of the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard or more. Sometimes 20, some 25. There's a very modest potential daytime view shed impact during certain weather conditions, but we're in a different situation than these projects that are built just a few miles from shore, which you know, can cause some opposition among local communities. There's been landfall cable pushback on those in some communities, less so where we've been working, or at least we've worked enough with the community to make sure those issues have been quelled a bit. But those are, you know, I think those are also short term. There are many, you know, cables, electric cables that make landfall in various areas, and there's very little you know, evidence of any kind of you know, need for concern there.
Well, you have really been on it as we've jumped around here. I'm going to reserve the last word here for Glenn with the invitation for the presenters, if you're available, to stay on for a few minutes. I know there were a few questioners who might want to use their voice to ask a few things after the fact, if you've got 5 or 10 minutes. I know you've got that other meeting coming up. So
I just want to thank you,
Glenn,
Ellen, for being such a good manager of the chat room, and Nate and for being such good hosts today. And Jen, I should say. There's so much to get through. I mean, it's an incredibly new industry, so all of these, the engineering, the technology, it's all new. So there's quite a learning curve, and we are happy to help you articulate that to the wider community in the interest of creating sustainable energy source and work, good jobs in this community. So it's been a pleasure to have you both here today to unpack some of this. We'd love to have you back at a later stage, because you can see there's a long tail lead up to that. And I just wanted to also remind you that next week we've got some very special guests, Rodney Evans and Aaron Dignan from the Ready, who are transformational sort of work culture speakers. They've got a tremendous network called Brave New Work, and they'll be joining us next week to talk about the challenges of what the new work looks like. So I want to wrap it up and thanking Jen, Nate, Eleanor, and particularly Gavin, did you want to have a word to close the gate? Are you good? Okay. Again, everybody, it's been a wonderful opportunity to get together. We know that time is precious, and wish you all a happy 4th of July and hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. I know there were some unanswered questions there. We're happy to answer those offline. The conversation can go on for hours, so maybe we can follow up.
Julie Mar, thank you for giving your contact info, and likely you'll be hearing from some stakeholders and this is a great chance for people to plug in. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.